and welcome to this Sunday's ramble around the churchyard of St. Nicholas Church. I want to, in this ramble, link a story together of the little monument, or the monument that's in the churchyard to the little orphans, tie it to a important landowner and farmer within the 19th century, John Thomas Overton, and also to the building of St. Nicholas and the architect Edwin Nash, and raise questions as well about social justice as well. Now, I am enormously grateful as we explore the churchyard for the support that Enjoy Sutton has provided, and also the encouragement of the Sutton Civic Society. And so these rambles are very much about them as well and their priorities, which of course for the Sutton Civic Society is all about engaging creatively with the council, making sure that priorities are placed on developing Sutton in a way that allows everyone to be proud of their town centre. With Enjoy Sutton, that's the group that represents the over 400 businesses that make up the High Street area, part of the Business Improvement District, and all the work that they do trying to make sure that Sutton, Central Sutton, is a great place to live and work. Now, I mentioned a couple of things as we, or I will be mentioning a couple of things that we'll be looking at in terms of history. If you want to know more about history and delve deeper, then I would recommend that you go to Sutton College. They have some fantastic courses within history and culture curriculum. They'll allow you to explore things like the development of poor law, some of the questions about the social justice of things like the way in which the poor were treated in the 19th century as part of the poor law reforms. But where I'm going to start, actually, is I'm going to take you back to one of the oldest buildings in Sutton. Now, one of the oldest buildings, this building that I'm talking about, is Sutton Lodge, and it's up on the Brighton Road. I think it's still used as a daycare centre, an older person's daycare centre. Now, I think I've discussed this, a little bit of this in an earlier ramble. But that lodge, Sutton Lodge, was built around 1745 by a brewer called John Wells. Now, the 4 acres of land that Wells bought was known as Downs Close in 1745. Back then, the Brighton Road, as we call it, was actually called Sutton Lane, and it was unmetalled. The Turnpike Trust wouldn't actually start work on improving the road until 10 years later in 1755. To have been bought by a brewer, it's reasonable to assume that the house had a water supply, a very rare thing for any of the houses up above the Carshalton and Cheam roads. That South Sutton is very, very poorly supplied with water. It had to have had a deep well that would provide the water needed for brewing. And the building may well have been built speculatively in anticipation of the road that was going to be remade and come under the terms of the Turnpike Trust. And so Wells obtained a mortgage against it about 9 years later to allow for the extension of the property. And the deeds described it then as a new brick messuage and dwelling house with several stables, granaries, outhouses, edifices, and buildings. So it was very much in a good estate there. Now, in 1762, Sutton Lodge was purchased by Thomas Thomas, a London merchant, for £300 he paid for it. Now, when John Rock published this map, this is his map of Surrey in 1768, the house at Downs Close had become known as Little Hell. And there's some reason to believe that when the Reverend Matthew Thomas, so this is a local priest from Epsom, Reverend Matthew Thomas, came into possession of the property, he tried to change its character. And so it's probably moving, at that point it ceases to be a an ale house to become a private dwelling and farm. So Reverend Thomas added wings to each side of the house, and it must have changed hands at least once before a Henry Froggatt sold it to Mr. John Thomas Overton, and the Overton family came from Cheam, and they paid around £700 for it in 1838. And the rate book of 1858 credits the estate as being 145 acres. And so he was by far the largest farmer in Sutton at that time. So J.T. Overton, John Thomas, was an important figure within the parishes of Sutton. I say parishes because towards the end of his life, of course, the parishes of Sutton had been broken up from the large medieval Sutton into new parishes at Christchurch and Ben Hilton, and also budding off into New Carrot Parish in the Sutton Newtown area. But in the 1840s, Overton had been a church warden at St. Nicholas, and there are records of him supervising the distribution of charity to the poor of the parish. But poor laws and how you oversaw the care for those people who were poor was going through rapid changes in the 19th century. And as a result of some of the poor law reforms in 1851 to 1853, it was quite a long, protracted building process. A new residential school was erected on the west side of the Brighton Road at Sutton. And so this is very close to very close to Sutton Lodge. So it's very on the doorstep of Mr. Overton. And the new building was massive. It was estimated at the time in 1853 to actually have 890 children and staff on top of that too. So a central entrance and administrative block existed in the buildings. There contained a dining hall, a water tower, dormitories. There were separate quadrangles on each side with the boys. Initially, it was just the boys, and then there were girls to the south as well. Those boys and girls came on site by 1853. So this was all the result of the 1834 Poor Law Act, which had led to the improvements and the arrangements made for the education of what is delightfully called pauper children. So the school had been built for the South Metropolitan School District, and this had been formed in 1849 to serve the unions of Bermondsey, Camberwell, Greenwich and St. Olaves and Woolwich, so very much southeast London. And there was a general policy of separating the children from their parents who were considered to be a bad influence on their children, and thus sending them to the country was seen to be a good thing. And this was very much an industrial school. So the school provided industrious habits, industrial training for the poor and orphaned children from this inner London, what we would think of as inner London now. And they were taught practical subjects such as carpentry, shoemaking, bricklaying, with the aim of setting up the attendees with a professional trade for working life. And what they didn't want is to find those repeating, if you like, the habits of their parents, which caused them to have ended up in the poorhouse. The building was designed by Edwin Nash. Edwin Nash is somebody that St. Nicholas people know very well, because he's the same architect who designed the new St. Nicholas Church that was eventually going to be completed in 1864. So this was a commission for the school, which ultimately led him to get the commission for St. Nicholas Church. He was known then by the people. He was a trusted subject, if you like. So the school had a number of problems associated with its expansion, its slow development, and it was nicknamed the Linger School because of that. But the school continued to expand, and although they had not implemented Nash's plans all at once, they gradually expanded the school. And the school took, the girls were moved into the new wings of the building, as the school grew. But in 1853, there was a very severe fire. Now, I'm quoting here from the London Illustrated News. And so this was from this story in 1856. The fire was discovered in a small blanket store in the upper story of the New South Wing, occupied by the girls. Owing to a deficiency in the supply of water, and to the enormous quantity of fir timber employed in the construction of the building, it was impossible to arrest the progress of the flames. They leapt from beam to beam and from window to window with amazing rapidity, and the brilliant light afforded by the burning roof aided in the certain and immediate deliverance of the 900 children in the building. Not one of them suffered the least personal injury. When they first perceived their danger, their screams, or rather yells, were most fearful. The nurses and officers who sleep in the apartments near them were soon amidst them. Silence was obtained, and they were directed down some stairs, which led them through the front apartments into the grounds. Previously, the nurse of the girls' dormitory, who first discovered the fire, had rescued the sick committed to her care. Similarly, 200 infants were delivered by the exertions of the nurses and servants over them. Too much praise cannot be awarded to those women who, without any direction, had the presence of mind to rescue so many young and sick. It was this good work that never thought of their own clothes and property which has been consumed. Many of the children were only partially dressed. The majority were shrouded in sheets and blankets. Some sat nursing a little one on the green turf bordering the garden. Others stood in groups observing the quick spread of the fire, while the elder ones assisted in removing the valuable furniture and clothing. The scene at this moment was extremely sad and affecting. The air was cold, and drizzling rain began to fall. Shortly afterwards, the sick, infants and girls, formed a sad procession with their sheets around them to the houses and stables of Mr. Overton, a neighbouring farmer, who very generously lent every possible help. At its peak, there were over 1,000 pupils at the school, all orphans. Now, these were either actual orphans or administrative orphans who had been separated from their parents. From 1855 onwards, the registers of St. Nicholas start to record the deaths of children at the home. The first I found is that of Elizabeth Findlay, who died aged 5 3/4 years. Each year, the Reverend Vernon, the curate of St. Nicholas, would bury 2 or 3 children from the school. Sometimes there would be 2 or 3 needing to be buried over the space of a few days, indicating an outbreak of infection at the school. These orphan deaths and burial in what would have been an unmarked grave made a significant impact on the congregation of St. Nicholas. In the 1920s, the Sunday school children at St. Nicholas arranged for a monument to those orphaned children buried in their churchyard. And still to this day, flowers are laid occasionally at the little monument. The industrial school closed in the early years of the 20th century and was converted into a mental asylum, with other parts of it being continuing as an institution for essentially the poor. So John Thomas Overton died in 1882 and was buried in the family grave at St. Nicholas. The history of the school and St. Nicholas was still intertwined into the 1880s, because after Mr. Overton's death in 1882, the school acquired a site on Bansford Road from his estate, and a separate girls' institution, Down School, was established there. In 1884, a new resident medical officer was appointed to the South Metropolitan District School. And this was a Dr. George Rice, who had trained under the great famous physician Lister. He was paid a generous annual salary of £100 per year for working at the new school, and another £350 for working at the old school. This photograph shows a distinguished-looking Dr. Rice centrally positioned among the nursing staff at what became the Belmont Workhouse's infirmary, who were all seated against the backdrop of the building's brick facade. Dr. George Rice was part of the congregation of St. Nicholas, and he and his wife, Florence, had 2 of their children baptized there. So you can see that we've brought a story of links, the Overton Monument in the churchyard, to the orphans in the churchyard, and to the life, about showing how St. Nicholas, within the context of Sutton, has grown and grown. Do subscribe to the YouTube channel, as all of the rambles are listed there. And as I said, I've touched on a number of different subjects that you probably will want to think about more. If you want to know anything more about these topics, then do contact Sutton College, who have got an excellent history and culture curriculum. This just about wraps it up. So for now, I'm going to say goodbye. So long, Sutton. Your history.